All right, futures under pressure here today. S&P futures down 0.93%, Dow futures down 0.66%, and NASDAQ leading the way lower at minus 0.12%. Gold futures up by nearly 2% here in the pre-market. Let's go to our cues from the last session. Information technology, consumer discretionary, and communication services stocks recorded the biggest gains on Monday, leading most sectors on the S&P 500 to a positive close. However, consumer staples and healthcare stocks bucked the overall market trend, closing the session lower. This rally saw U.S. stocks settle higher, with the NASDAQ composite gaining more than 2% as President Trump softened his tone on China, reversing Friday's sell-off and reigniting risk appetite. Leading the charge on Monday was Oracle, ticker ORCL. Shares jumped more than 5%, while NVIDIA gained almost 3%, and Broadcom soared around 10% after OpenAI pledged a $500 billion investment to co-develop 10 gigawatts of custom AI accelerators with the chipmaker. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said the ongoing government shutdown has started to affect the real economy, and accused the mainstream media of, quote, downplaying the shutdown, end quote, to, quote, avoid embarrassing Democrats, end quote, further exacerbating the public's understanding of the situation's severity. Meanwhile, the 10-year Treasury bond yielded 4.01% and the 2-year bond at 3.47%. Remember, we would really like to see that Treasury bond yield under 4%, so we're moving in the right direction, but not quite there yet. We do have some stocks in focus here today because this morning, or today, is the start of the new earnings season. We kicked it off with the banks here today. First one on the list is going to be Goldman Sachs. They fell 0.6 ahead of its earnings before the opening bell. Analysts estimate $11 per share on revenue of $14.1 billion. Goldman Sachs had an EPS of 12.25, which beat that estimate, and sales of $15 billion, which beat the $14.1 billion estimate. Goldman Sachs trading lower now in the pre-market despite that beat. The conference call is ongoing. JPMorgan was up 0.5 as analyst earnings estimates of $4.84 per share on revenue of $45.39 billion. JPMorgan had an EPS of 5.07, which beat the $4.84 estimate, and sales of $47.12 billion. That ended up beating the $45 billion estimate. JPMorgan, too, trading lower here today. Closed at 307.97 yesterday, currently trading exactly at 307 now. So down marginally, but still down on the back of that beat. Johnson & Johnson, ticker JNJ, that was 0.23% lower ahead of its earnings before the opening bell. Analysts estimate earnings of $2.75 per share on revenue of $23.74 billion. Johnson & Johnson did an EPS of $2.80, which beat that $2.75 estimate, and sales were $23.99 billion versus the $23.74 billion that was estimated. Johnson & Johnson here in the pre-market currently sitting at $190.90, pretty much right where it closed. Johnson & Johnson shares flat here. Citigroup also slated to report earnings. Citi was 0.44% higher as analysts' estimates for earnings per share of $1.90 on a revenue of $21.09 billion before the opening bell. I actually don't have Citi's earnings here yet. I'm not sure that they've reported. Citi here in the pre-market currently sitting at 96.40. It closed at 96.10, so roughly flat here today. Last stock on our list here is Polaris. Shares climbed 10.98% as it entered into a definitive agreement to sell a majority stake in Indian Motorcycle to an independent private equity firm, Carrollwood LP. That is ticker PII, Polaris.